Robert Wone was a successful 32-year-old attorney, and less than 90 minutes after arriving at his friend's house after a long workday, he was dead. The men inside the house told police that an unknown intruder broke in, stabbed him 3 times, and then disappeared into the night without ever being seen. At first, it sounded like a horrifying home invasion, but then detectives began to look more closely at the evidence that was left behind. The bedroom showed almost no sign that a violent attack had taken place there. The amount of blood didn't match the severity of Robert's injuries, and the weapon found beside him didn't add up either. Nothing about the scene or the situation made any sense. And when the medical examiner took a look at Robert's body, she discovered details that made this case even more difficult to explain. Today we're going to break down Robert Juan's final moments, the unusual autopsy findings, and the crime scene that the investigators believed held the truth. Somewhere inside the conflicting timelines, unexplained injuries, and missing pieces of evidence is the answer to one haunting question. What really happened to Robert Wone after he walked into that townhouse? Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell before you go. All right, my friends, let's get started on today's case because it is a wild one. Robert Eric Wone was born on June 1st, 1974 in Manhattan, New York. He grew up in Brooklyn as the child of a fourth-generation Chinese-American family that put a lot of pressure on education and discipline, and it showed. At Xavier in high school, Robert graduated at the top of his class as valedictorian, so he ranked #1 out of all the other students there. That is a massive accomplishment. He was naturally intelligent, and he was raised with the hard work ethic that it took to capitalize on it too. Robert graduated high school and then went on to the College of William and Mary as a James Monroe Scholar, which is an honor that's reserved for only the university's top incoming students. During his 1992 to 1993 academic year there, Robert met a senior named Joseph Price. The two of them immediately became friends because they had so much in common. They were both in honor society and student government, and this friendship would continue on for many years later. Price graduated the following year and moved on with his life and career, but he and Robert always stayed in touch. Robert continued to succeed in college the same way that he did in high school. After William and Mary, he went on to law school. Then he built a career as an attorney in Washington, D.C. He spent time at a prestigious law firm called Covington and Burling, which is one of the city's most respected legal institutions. And then he shifted his career towards public service. By the early summer of 2006, Robert felt that it was time to move on from private practice, though. He wanted to feel like his work was more meaningful. This led him to Radio Free Asia, which is a U.S. government-funded international broadcaster where he worked as general counsel. His colleagues there said that he was intelligent, dedicated, well-liked by everybody, and that he was a man that took on all responsibilities seriously, but he never lost his warmth. At a legal conference in January of 2002, Robert met a woman named Catherine or Kathy Yu. She was a fellow attorney and the daughter of Korean immigrants who had grown up in Chicago. What started as just a simple conversation at a conference turned into a very serious relationship within a year. Robert proposed, then Kathy relocated to be with him in Washington, and the two of them were married by 2003. This newly married couple was so happy, and they were in love. They had similar backgrounds and interests, and they maintained their ambitions together. The two of them seemed like a match made in heaven. They eventually settled into their home in Oakton, Virginia, which is a suburb about 40 minutes away from downtown Washington. On the evening of August 2nd, 2006, Robert had to work late at his office at Radio Free Asia in downtown Washington. It was a long and challenging workday, so instead of taking the long drive back to Oakton at about 9 or 10 at night, only to turn around and make that same trek back a few hours later, Robert decided to make other plans with his old college friend, Joseph Price. Joseph was an attorney as well, working with organizations like Equality Virginia. He lived in a townhome at 1509 Swan Street Northwest in Washington's DuPont Circle neighborhood. This is a beautiful, green, historic pocket of the city known for its Victorian row houses. Price lived in his $1.2 million home with his partner named Victor Zaborski, who worked in the dairy industry, and they also had a third roommate named Dylan Ward, who was a massage therapist. The three men said that they were in a polyamorous family unit, so Price and Zaborski were domestic partners, and then Price and Ward also had a separate relationship. Joseph Price's house was only about a mile from Robert's job, so on crazy work days like this, it made sense for him to reach out to his college buddy to just stay there. Robert's wife, Kathy, was aware of this plan too, and she knew Price and his partner, Victor, pretty well by this point. But Kathy never felt worried because her husband was a happily married man, just staying the night with old friends, so nothing about this seemed unusual to her. Robert arrived at the Swan Street townhome at about 10:30 that night. He was let in, greeted by his friends, and then he went up to the second floor guest bedroom because although he was very happy to see his buddies, he wanted to get some sleep. Robert was wearing a gray William and Mary t-shirt, gym shorts, and boxers. At 11:05 that night, an email was sent from Robert's BlackBerry to his wife saying that he had just showered and was about to go to sleep. 2 minutes later, at 11:07, another email was sent to one of his colleagues confirming a work lunch date. Both of these messages didn't go through, though. Somewhere between 10:30 and 11:30, according to nearby neighbors, a terrifying scream came from the direction of the townhouse. At 11:49 p.m., a 911 dispatcher took a call from a man named Victor Zaborski calling from 1509 Swan Street Northwest. He was distraught, crying, and frantic, and he said, "We need an ambulance. Our friend has been stabbed." When the dispatcher asked who had done this, he said that somebody broke in and the attacker was a random intruder. Paramedics arrived in under 5 minutes, but as the crew made their way up the stairs, they passed by Dylan Ward standing near his bedroom door. Instead of him guiding them toward his injured friend, Ward turned around and immediately went back inside of his room. First responders are trained to treat victims or patients, but they also have to assess for scene safety and read the room. They have to pay attention to everything. Think about how often they get deposed and end up testifying in court. One of the EMTs said that at this very moment, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. What they found when they reached the second floor, though, was absolutely horrifying. Robert Juan was found lying on the pull-out sofa bed on his back with what turned out to be 3 stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. The bed was still neatly made underneath him with the sheets tucked in, and nothing had really been disturbed, so it didn't seem like any kind of violence or struggle had just taken place there. One of the stab wounds to Robert's torso was large enough to fit a hand inside of it, but surprisingly, there was very little blood, not on his clothes, the bed, or the floor. There was a light film of blood across his abdomen, almost as if he'd been wiped instead of naturally coming from an open wound. This immediately struck them as odd. Zaborski, Price, and Ward had all recently showered, and all 3 of them were wearing bathrobes when help arrived, but their composure also struck the first responders as strange. They all had this eerie calmness about them that didn't match the panic that the 911 dispatcher heard when they called, or the horror of what had just happened in their own home. And remember, Joseph Price was a dear friend for many years at this point. Robert was quickly rushed to George Washington University Hospital, and his family, including his wife Kathy, his in-laws, and his little brother, all raced to the hospital, expecting for him to be alive, just in critical condition. But sadly, when they arrived, it was already too late. He was gone. Robert Wone was pronounced dead at 12:24 a.m. on August 3, 2006, at just 32 years old. Kathy called Robert's friend Joseph Price to find out exactly what happened because she was in total shock, and Price told Kathy over the phone that Robert had been stabbed in the back, but the wounds that the coroner found wouldn't agree with that statement. Now, sure, we can assume that this was just a miscommunication, but this wouldn't be the last time that a story from inside the Swan Street house didn't match the physical facts. But before we go into the crime scene, we need to spend some time in the autopsy. And be prepared, because this is one of the most bizarre autopsies we've ever covered here. The autopsy performed on Robert Wone was performed by Dr. Lois Goslanowski in DC, and her findings would become the most argued over piece of evidence in this entire case. Robert died from 3 stab wounds to the chest and torso, and the ME's report said that they were uniform, perfect slit-like defects that had been inflicted almost methodically. Now, in a typical violent attack or stabbing where there's a resisting and panicking victim, wound margins should appear jagged and irregular. A moving target and a moving blade would have caused torn wound tracks, not clean ones. Robert's wounds showed none of that irregularity, though. How and why? He was young and healthy enough to fight back, and yet these injuries were even, symmetrical, and precise, each about 4 to 5 inches deep. One of the 3 stab wounds was especially catastrophic, though, because it perforated the heart, the coronary artery, and the inferior vena cava, which is one of the body's largest veins. A wound like this would lead to internal hemorrhaging very quickly, so this wound alone wouldn't have been survivable. Dr. Goslinowski said that Robert lost about 75% of his blood volume into his chest cavity, which may be why there was very little blood at the crime scene. Another weird finding is that Robert had zero defensive wounds, and again, he was a very healthy young 32-year-old man, so this didn't make sense. Defensive wounds, like to the forearms, arms, or hands, for instance, come from reflexes that are so deeply wired into us as humans that their absence actually tells us a lot. There were no ligature marks, so we know that Robert was not fighting back because he was bound by anything. To complicate things even further, the responding trauma team said that the time from injury to unconsciousness would have taken about 10 to 12 minutes based on the cardiac electrical activity that was recorded by the paramedics when they got to the house. This means that if Robert was conscious and aware of what was happening during the attack, then he would have had a decent amount of time to react, resist, or at least attempt to run away. But he chose not to fight off this unknown attacker. In my opinion, the strangest autopsy finding of all is that Dr. Goslinowski documented 6 pre-mortem needle puncture marks all across his body. These were injections that happened before Robert was killed. They were found on his chest, his right foot, his left hand, and several more in the left side of his neck. Before you ask like I did, these were not wounds that were made by the responding paramedics or hospital staff, and the emergency responders confirmed that they didn't give him any injections at the scene either. Kathy Wone also confirmed to the investigators that her husband had no prior puncture marks or any medical reason to have been recently injected either. I'm sure that leads you to wondering about the toxicology report. The lab tested specimens from Robert's femoral blood, heart blood, urine, bile, vitreous humor, liver, brain, and gastric content, so this was a comprehensive standard panel. The screen covered alcohol, common illegal drugs, and several drugs that are commonly used to sedate and take advantage of victims like GHB and benzodiazepines. Every single result came back negative. But remember, a negative screen is not proof that nothing was injected. Toxicology is not a single, all-encompassing test. It's a series of targeted assays, and a lab can only find what it specifically knows to look for. Fast-acting paralytics used in medical settings, along with other incapacitating agents, were never a part of the standard panel that they ran on Robert because when these samples were taken, there was no reason to point investigators towards any specific substance. By the time the investigators considered more testing, though, the usable blood sample was almost gone, so there was barely enough for a handful of additional targeted tests, let alone a broad-spectrum test after this. The more you're looking for, the more blood you need to test. Ketamine specifically was a substance that many experts suspected, but ketamine has a very short half-life and a narrow window to be detected, so typically only 2 to 4 days post-exposure it would be tested. So any argument that ketamine would be involved couldn't be ruled in or out by the time they thought of this. Even though this was incredibly frustrating and we can't know for certain what was injected, these marks do explain why Robert didn't fight back. He couldn't because he had been drugged. There are 2 more findings that I want to talk about before we wrap up the autopsy portion of this video. First, the ME found small petechial hemorrhages on Robert's eyelids, and as we know from several recent cases, this is a sign of strangulation. So on top of being injected with some unknown substance and stabbed multiple times, Robert was either strangled or suffocated, and this is overkill. The killer took their time, and in my opinion, that doesn't seem like a typical MO from a random attacker that broke in. They would be in a rush to get out of there, especially with other people in the home. And last but not least, the ME found Robert's own seminal fluids on his private areas and inside of his rectum. This was confirmed through DNA matching to be his own, so it was not a match to any of the 3 men at the house or an unknown profile, so it wasn't from an attacker either. I'm very rarely stumped when it comes to details in the autopsy findings, but let me know your thoughts on this because I'm scratching my head at how this could have happened. Now, this doesn't prove that contact with another person happened either, but its location and presence raised enough concern that the investigators and prosecutors treated it as evidence of an assault. This would be taken back later though because there were no other injuries, just the fluids, so the experts felt that this may not have been related to the attack, but still, this was unexplainable and it added another disturbing, unresolved layer to an already unusual autopsy. So to close out the report, Dr. Goslinowski listed the cause of death as the stab wounds, and of course the manner of death was homicide. Now, as if the autopsy wasn't complex enough, the crime scene is about to complicate things even further. From the moment that the Metropolitan Police Department detectives began to work the townhome at 1509 Swan Street, the crime scene seemed to contradict every story told by the three men that lived there. Let's start with this supposed intruder. Price, Zaborski, and Ward each told a version of the same story that an unknown intruder broke into the home, made his way to the second floor guest bedroom, stabbed Robert, and then ran away, all without any of the three men getting a good look at him. All three of them admitted that they heard a commotion, followed by a bunch of grunts coming from the guest bedroom, and then the sound of someone moving through the house before escaping. They all thought that the intruder came in through the back door and that they may have left it unlocked. Then they jumped the back garden fence to get out of there. Investigators found this story very hard to believe almost immediately, though, for several reasons. There was no physical evidence of forced entry anywhere on the property, and nothing inside the house had been taken either. This was a very wealthy area of town, and yet no wallets, watches, or electronics were taken, despite an intruder having free reign of the home for however long the attack took. The layout of the house also made their statements hard to believe, because in order to get to the guest bedroom where Robert was found, an intruder would need to climb an uncarpeted, creaky wooden staircase, walk directly past Dylan Ward's bedroom at the top of the stairs, and then continue for another 18 feet down the hallway to the opposite end of the house to find Robert. So, this attacker broke into this luxurious home, went straight to Robert's room on the one night that he's there, killed him, took nothing, and left, and all of that without being seen. None of the three men heard footsteps on that staircase before or after the attack, by the way. When it came to the murder weapon, Joseph Price initially told the police that he'd found a kitchen knife resting on top of Robert's torso, and then he moved it to a nearby end table. Then later he changed his story, saying that he pulled the knife directly out of Robert's body. That is a huge difference, and it's also common sense to not disrupt a crime scene, especially for an attorney. So, my immediate first thought was he trying to create an alibi as to how maybe his DNA ended up on the weapon? Let me know if that crossed your mind too. The knife itself was also a mystery at first because when it was compared with Robert's wounds, the blade didn't fit. Each of Robert's stab wounds measured 4 to 5 inches deep, but the boning knife that was recovered at the scene was about 5.5 inches long. This was too long to produce Robert's wounds. Dr. Gozanowski said that it was highly unlikely that an attacker using this particular knife would have inflicted 3 separate wounds, stopping short of driving the blade all the way in, and all 3 stopped at the exact same point. That kind of restraint would be more consistent with careful, controlled motions, not an attack by a frenzied stranger. The blood evidence on this knife also didn't make any sense because investigators found that the blade had been wiped down and fibers consistent with a towel were found on it, but there were no fibers that matched Robert's t-shirt. If this knife had been used to stab through his shirt, then it should have picked up fibers from it. The towel fibers made it clear that it had been deliberately cleaned after the fact, which raised even more questions about why anyone would wipe down a knife that was possibly staged. So, we have a knife that was found that's measurements don't match Robert's wounds, that was wiped off, but there's an even more important weapon that we need to talk about. This knife actually came from a partial 3-piece knife set that was kept in Dylan Ward's bedroom. And remember, Dylan is the one that the EMTs said was calm as they passed by, and he just turned around and went into his room in a very eerie way. The box for this set of knives was recovered by the police during their search, and one knife from that set was missing from Dylan's room. The missing knife's dimensions, based on the box and other pieces, were reportedly about 1/2 inch shorter than the boning knife found at the scene, meaning this missing knife was actually closer in size to what the wound depths were. This knife was never recovered, but this is going to come up again later. When it came to the lack of blood found in the guest bedroom, paramedic Jeffrey Baker reported that Robert did have that light smear of blood across his abdomen, and that was pretty much it. But he also testified that the 911 operator had specifically told Victor Zaborski that he needed to apply pressure to the wound with a towel as they waited for help to arrive. But the paramedic found no evidence of any towels at the scene when he arrived, so none of the men applied pressure or even tried to save Robert's life despite being told to do so. Investigators attempted blood detection testing all throughout the house, but they used an improperly applied reagent, so they couldn't really tell if what they found was blood at all. They did bring in a cadaver dog, though, to search the property, and the dog alerted on 2 specific locations, the lint dryer trap and the drain near the back patio. This means that blood-soaked materials or clothes had been washed, or that fluid had been rinsed down an exterior drain, like maybe during a cleanup. The investigators did not take any DNA swabs from either location, and they failed to report on the dog's findings from their initial affidavit. This is one of many reasons that the defense felt that the police's work in this case was sloppy at best. Detectives brought in all three men for interviews on the night of the murder, and each of them spoke with police voluntarily and without an attorney present. Their interviews were recorded, and Joseph Price was interviewed for about 6 hours, Victor Zaborski for about 8, and Dylan Ward for approximately 12 hours. Investigators found dozens of small inconsistencies between the three of their stories, especially when it came to details about timing, who did what and when, the sequence of events that evening, and none of it ever fully lined up. Investigators spent a very long time trying to pin down exactly how much time passed between Robert's arrival and Zaborski's 911 call, and the reason this was so important was because a reenactment would tell the police whether or not their stories were possible. If their version of events couldn't be reenacted within their time frame, then someone inside that house was lying, and they may have done this to Robert. We know that the BlackBerry emails went out at 11:05 and 11:07, and the neighbors heard screams sometime before 11:35 during the 11 o'clock news broadcast. The 911 call came in at 11:49, so that leaves a window of no more than about an hour and 19 minutes from Robert's arrival to the emergency call, and an even smaller window, like 15 to 20 minutes, between the scream and the moment that Zaborski picked up the phone. Within that smaller time window, according to the three men, an unknown intruder would have needed to enter the home undetected, find and access a kitchen knife, make his way silently up a creaky staircase, pass directly by an occupied bedroom, travel the length of the house to reach a guest who nobody knew was there, inflict 3 controlled and precise stab wounds without making it seem like there was any kind of struggle beyond the one scream, and then escape without being seen, heard, or leaving behind any signs of forced entry. Investigators laid all of that out, and they determined that this was not possible. Let me know if you feel the same way. For more than 2 years after Robert Juan's death, no one was charged with any crimes. The investigation moved slowly, delayed by one obstacle after another, and the case was handed from one federal prosecutor to another too. At the same time, detectives were waiting on crucial forensic testing from the FBI crime lab, and those results took far longer than anybody expected. In 2007, investigators were actually close to making an arrest, but an unexpected event complicated the entire investigation. The Swan Street house where Robert was killed was broken into and burglarized by Joseph Price's own brother, Michael Price, and another man. More than $7,000 worth of electronics were taken from the home, which complicated everything because investigators were still trying to preserve and examine evidence from the house. Although the two men were charged in connection with burglary, those charges were eventually dropped. On the first anniversary of Robert's death, his widow, Kathy Wone, spoke to the public about this case for the first time. She stood before reporters and she pleaded for anyone with information to please come forward. She then specifically called out Joseph Price, Victor Zaborski, and Dylan Ward to tell investigators what they knew. Robert's wife and family needed and deserved these answers, so this public name drop was a way to add pressure and hopefully get them to talk. It wasn't until 2008, so over 2 years after Robert's murder, that criminal charges were finally filed. Dylan Ward moved to Florida, and he was charged with obstruction to justice, and then Price and Zaborski were arrested shortly after. Initially, all three of them were released while awaiting trial under strict conditions, including electronic ankle monitors and curfews. But a month later, prosecutors added conspiracy charges against all three of them, and those monitoring restrictions were lifted too. One major issue that continued to disrupt this case, though, was the fact that the murder weapon was still missing. Ward's mom testified that she kept one of the household's missing knives after the murder, but years later, when investigators asked her for it, she couldn't remember which knife from her own kitchen set had originally went missing, so she turned over 2 identical boning knives instead. That made it impossible to say whether either knife had anything to do with Robert's death. In other words, the history of those knives became so confusing that investigators were never able to identify the weapon used in the attack. None of the 3 men were ever charged with murder because of this. Prosecutors believed that someone inside that house knew exactly what happened, but they didn't have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt which person had actually stabbed Robert. So, instead of filing for a murder charge, they focused on what they believed they did have evidence to clearly support. This was obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. The case finally went to trial in the summer of 2010, And instead of having a jury decide the outcome, all three defendants waived that right and they chose for the judge to hear the evidence and issue the verdict themselves. None of the three defendants testified in their own defense either. Most of the trial focused on competing forensic experts because there was very little direct evidence here. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no clear murder weapon either, so both sides relied heavily on forensics to support their arguments. Prosecutors pointed to what they believed were signs of a staged crime scene, including the missing blood, missing towel, wounds that didn't appear to match the recovered knife, and the lack of defensive injuries. The defense challenged those conclusions, though, with their own experts. During cross-examination, the medical examiner also acknowledged that she couldn't completely rule out the recovered knife as the murder weapon, which really weakened one of the prosecutor's main arguments in this trial. So, in the end, both sides presented the same evidence, but they just interpreted it very differently. On June 29, 2010, Judge Leibovitz announced her decision. She found all three defendants not guilty on every charge. She did say that she believed all three men likely knew exactly who killed Robert Juan, but the problem was that believing something is not the same thing as proving it in court. She said this whole case was like a math problem because although the circumstantial evidence was suspicious, the individual pieces simply didn't add up. Even after the acquittals, though, the legal battle wasn't over. Before the criminal trial even ended, Kathy Wone filed a $20 million wrongful death lawsuit against all three of the men, and she alleged that they failed to help her husband, destroyed evidence, and worked together to interfere with this investigation. Unlike a criminal case where guilt has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, a civil lawsuit requires far less. The plaintiff only has to show that something is more likely to have happened than not. The three defendants announced that they plan to invoke their Fifth Amendment right instead of testifying, so instead of taking the case to trial, both sides eventually agreed to just settle outside of court. On August 3, 2011, 5 years after Robert's death, the lawsuit was resolved for an undisclosed amount. After the settlement, Kathy Wone said that she chose to end this legal fight instead of continuing through another lengthy court battle. Then she said, quote, "I am moving on. I want to spend the next 40 years of my life focusing on good. They can rot from the inside out from all the secrets that they chose to keep. That's their choice. I chose to move on," end quote. She is so strong, and I love the perspective that she has. Today, no one has ever been charged with Robert Juan's murder. Joseph Price and Dylan Ward legally changed their names and moved to different careers as well. And Victor Zaborski kept his name and he continued working in the dairy industry. More than 2 decades later, Robert Juan's case remains open and unsolved. Statutes of limitations doesn't apply to murder in the District of Columbia, which means that this case can still be charged if new evidence or a new confession ever comes. Robert Juan left for work on the morning of August 2nd, 2006, expecting to come home to his wife the following day, but he never got the chance. Whatever happened inside of 1509 Swan Street that night took that chance from him and from everyone who loved him. And nearly 20 years later, his family is still searching for the truth. Robert's family and friends have spent years without the answers that most families of murder victims eventually receive. Scholarships and fellowships were set up in Robert's memory, including at his alma mater, William and Mary, where memorial benches sit with the lyrics of "What a Wonderful World" in his name. I pray that Robert is resting peacefully and that his family will receive these answers soon. Thank you so much for listening to Robert's story today and, of course, for hanging out with me. Today has to be one of the most frustrating, confusing, twist and turn cases that we've covered here in a very long time, so I'm really looking forward to see what you thought about it. I am so grateful for each and every one of you, and I truly could never express how much it means to me that you're here, especially while I'm pregnant and out of breath recording each week, but the end is near. I'm almost 37 weeks by the time this video goes up, so we're gonna have a little true crime baby here anytime, and don't worry, I will still be here every week. I know that I say this at the end of every video to please do something good for your mental health, and please do that, but I wanted to sneak in something that brings me a lot of joy. I love watching Shark Week on Discovery Channel, and depending on when you're watching this video, it could be going on right now. This year it's scheduled Sunday, July 26th through Saturday, August 1st, so if you like watching Shark Week like I do, here's your reminder that it's happening this week. Anyways, drop our butterfly secret handshake in the chat if you made it to the end of the video, and I will see you next time.